Hello, everybody. This is Judy Maddox. I am chair of our local Sierra Club. We are called WNC Sierra Club. We used to be called Winoka. Both of those names will get you into our website and to our meetup and to our Facebook. We would love for you to like us everywhere you can like us. And certainly if you are not on our mailing list, we send something out every second Saturday. We tell you what these wonderful programs are every first Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock on Zoom, and also our alerts. And certainly our alert right now is the election. Yes, not a surprise for everyone. We are part of the Sierra Club, both nationally and statewide. Our motto is explore, enjoy, and protect our beautiful planet. We want to acknowledge with respect that the land we were on today is ancestral land belonging to the Cherokee. We thank them for protecting our forests and our environment for so very many generations. And right now, as you know, with the election, we have 2 more days of early voting, which ends the times on Saturday are from 8 in the morning to 3.
They're making announcements.
I'm needing those of you who are entering, please mute yourself and to go dark. But I'm also asking if you can possibly volunteer tomorrow or Saturday, and definitely on Tuesday for election day. We need volunteers to hand out our endorsement cards at a number of shifts. And as people walk up and say, oh no, we know who we're voting for, if you will remind them that we have endorsements for nonpartisan, for certainly the North Carolina Supreme Court is very, very important. The bonds that will give us 20% of our open farmland to be put in conservation for before or by 2030, 20%, which would be wonderful to preserve our open land and in greenways and in parks. So we would love to have your help. If you will go to our website, crclub.org, there will be a button there that will tell you how to sign up, or you can contact me, and my name is certainly on the website as well. And election day is Tuesday. The polls are 6:30 in the morning to 7:30 at night, but we have shifts all day and all over the county that you could handcraft as to what works for you. I want to make you aware that this is Lights Out Migratory Bird Awareness Month. The spring and the fall are proclaimed Bird Awareness Month. And please reduce your lights if you can. Please face them down to the ground if you have a night light, and encourage other people, business owners, building managers, residents, to please address this light pollution for our birds who are migrating through. Our next program, apropos, is on bird migration. It will be the first Thursday, December 1st. It's called Changing Feathers, Changing Seasons by Simon Thompson, who is an internationally known birder. He is going to be talking on climate change, the changing migration patterns that our birds coming through are being observed because we have warmer climates and birds are staying longer to the north. But he's going to have beautiful pictures of both birds in breeding plumage and birds that stay here all winter. And so now what you have signed on for is a wonderful diversity program of Western North Carolina, All Creatures Great and Small, by Rachel Muir, who is the great grandniece of John Muir, who created Sierra Club. Please do not raise your hand. Please put your questions in the chat, and I will ask Rachel at the end. The program is about 45 minutes, but she will stay and answer questions as long as you would like to ask questions. So now I will stop sharing and introduce Rachel, who is our advisor to our local Sierra Club. She is a scientist emeritus with the U.S. Department of the Interior, and she is a conservation biologist by trade. So Rachel, welcome, glad to have you. And you are on mute, Rachel.
Owners have a tremendous responsibility.
Richard, you're still muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Now, thank you for your patience. And share. Okay, how are we doing, everybody?
Good, Rachel, and you might raise your volume just a tad.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for the pleasure of being here. Thanks for coming to listen to our discussion this evening about biodiversity. I hope everyone, after this brief introduction to the topic, will want to vote for biodiversity. Certainly one of my favorite topics and something I'm pleased to be talking with you about this evening. So you can see in this opening slide, the theme here is all things great and small, and you have images of two North Carolina natives. One is the great, our red wolf, which is still extant in the eastern part of the state. And on the other side of the slide, we have an example of one of the small, a eastern beach tiger beetle. Now, interestingly, tiger beetles show up, some species show up on the endangered species list because we share a preferred habitat with tiger beetles. They love beaches and we love beaches. And it's competition for those beach sites is what sometimes gets those particular organisms in trouble. In any event, let's get started. We've got 45 minutes and a lot of diversity to cover. Admit, I've got the controls, so. Now, the loss of biodiversity is an international issue. It's a global issue. You can see from this sort of grim graph that we are losing, in particular, our top predators around the world in terms of population, and in some cases, we're seeing extinctions of these animals, which are critical to maintaining our ecosystems. Nonetheless, I'm not going to focus on an international stage this evening. I'm going to focus on the wonderful resources we have here in Western North Carolina. This is not going to be a gloom and doom kind of presentation. Biodiversity is something to rejoice in, and we've had some wonderful success. All the animals you see here on this page have been downlisted from the endangered species list. That black bear on the left-hand side is not our black bear, that's a Louisiana black bear. The eagles we all recognize, and the eagles were a symbol that I think to some degree got us started with the Endangered Species Act, with the Clean Air Act, and getting pesticides out of the ecosystems such as DDT. American alligators have been so successful, parts of the Southeast, you can hardly avoid stepping on one. And that little creature in the lower left-hand corner, and little creatures are my favorite subject for study, is an Oregon chub. That is another species that's been downlisted on the Endangered Species Act. Now, not all biodiversity is endangered, but we are most concerned about those that are becoming more rare, have decreasing populations, and to some degree that will be the focus of discussions this evening. One thing I wish I could see your all's faces. I'm used to teaching to folks in person, and I can sort of gauge how they react to the pictures I show. So I'm going to do my guesswork and hope that you're enjoying the show. One of the great celebrations is something that many of you may remember, and that is the issue of the snail darter that held up the great Tellico Dam on the Tennessee River system. And it was the cause of the only major amendments to the Endangered Species Act. In any event, the snail darter is back in habitats like the ones you see on the left-hand side, where this is a site I visit fairly regularly, looking for other rare species, including freshwater mussels. But as of October 4th, the snail darter is off the list. Again, I mentioned that biodiversity is a global issue, and I don't want any of us to forget that global perspective. This bumper sticker that dates back to, I think, 1973 is sort of burned into my imagination because it still is a guide on how I think we should direct our energies towards issues like biodiversity. I'm going to talk about our local biodiversity and some discussion of what we can do locally to protect it. The scenes you see here on the left-hand side are in the Andes in Ecuador with a dear friend of mine by the name of Rusty. On the right-hand side, you see the scene from Craigie Gardens. I think they're pretty equivalent myself. So part of my message is you don't have to go to exotic places to experience biodiversity and great views and great experience in nature. You can do that right here in Western North Carolina. So we'll begin with the basics. What is biodiversity? I'll excuse myself in advance. I had a 2-hour talk earlier today, so I'll be watering my voice frequently. So in any event, biodiversity has 3 components. It has species diversity, it has genetic diversity, and it has ecosystem diversity. On this page you see here, you see the diversity of one group of species. They are the sulfurs, the pirids, which are common in our part of the world. But let's get down to the details of what each one of those elements of diversity involve. The first is species diversity, and I think we all have an instinctive idea of what that involves, because we'll be seeing many examples of it through the slideshow. Ecosystem diversity is the diversity of the habitats that support these species. And most species have some strong relationship to a specific ecosystem type. We'll discuss more about that later. What may be less intuitive is the idea of genetic diversity. And quickly summarized as genetic diversity is the diversity within a species that allows it to adapt to change. So there's a lot of diversity in humans, and that is helpful for us to adapt to change. And as a species, we can be found everywhere on the planet. So clearly, we're a fairly adaptable species. Other organisms have some degree, more or less, of that same amount of genetic biodiversity. In any event, biodiversity is interwoven with geology, with the chemistry and the physics of the planet. Together, all those living things and the world in which we live constitutes the biosphere, of which this is a lovely view from our moon. And if you're not on mute yet, I recommend you do so. Thank you. So I said in the title that includes all things small and all things large. Here's a little bit of taste for all things small. And the scale of living things, humans are way up on the big end. You know, we're at the 99th percentile compared to most of the species and most of the biodiversity in the world. On the left-hand side, you see some inkling of how much diversity that is at the other end of the scale. And these are the arthropods. These are all insects here. There are quite a few here that are also local, I'm noticing looking at this slide, and that you could find in your backyard with a little bit of hunting. I'm pausing here on occasion to let people in. On the right-hand side, well, let me go back for a moment. Most of the biodiversity in the world that we know of, the 1.2 million species that we've identified so far, are tiny. They're arthropods, they're insects, spiders, and even things much smaller than that, things like tardigrades and other microorganisms. But nonetheless, they tend to be the critters that make the world go round and do most of the work. On the right-hand side, you see this is a Southern Appalachian endemic. It's Houstonia. It's the Roan Mountain Houstonia or Blewit. I have a little story about this one. Judy mentioned I have an ancestor connection. When John Muir came to visit North Carolina in 1898, he was invited to stay at the Biltmore. And in a letter that he sent back to his wife on October 1st of that same year, the letter said that he had a gracious time staying at the Biltmore, but in a short time he found it quite boring. He headed out to Roan Mountain, where you might have seen this very plant. In any event, the biodiversity here in the western portion of North Carolina attracted the attention of one of the great naturalists of his day. Oh. So again, it's all things grand, all things large. There's some good news in that regard, and also an indication of how little we know still about the biological diversity in the world. I mentioned that we've identified 1.2 million species. Well, our best guess, and it is a guess, is that there are about 8 to 10 million species on the planet. So that means we've only identified a fraction of the different kinds of organisms that share the Earth with us. We've got a big job ahead of us, but I think it's going to be a joyful venture if we get busy on it. Some of the good news is the blue whale, which was the largest organism ever to be found on the planet, is bouncing back to some degree. Historically, there were an estimated 300,000 blue whales in the Pacific Ocean in probably the early 1800s. 99.5% of that original population was killed during that whaling season. In any event, they are now returning to their native grounds in places like the southern portion of the Pacific Ocean. That's great news. One of the interesting things to remember about when species are fewer in number is that sometimes if they're a social species, like most whales, they lose the knowledge of where their best places to be are. For social organisms, a lot of the information that makes them successful in their habitat is literally passed on from generation to generation. Like in elephants, it's the old matrons in the elephant herds that know the best spots to go find water in the dry season, and et cetera. That's a component to diversity that I think is worth mentioning. Also, as an indicator of our continued ignorance of the world, on the right-hand side there, you see orcas, killer whales. The big news is this is a new species of orca that was discovered off the coast of South America in 2019. An organism that big, some 20 or 30 feet in length, and we're still discovering it. 95% of the ocean is essentially unknown to us. So that's an indication of how much more we have to learn about biodiversity on our planet. So I've talked about things large. One moment. Both in terms of species number and in terms of sheer numbers, we are a minor component of the planet. So among the organisms on the planet, here's a recent estimation that was published in the science literature, but also made the New York Times. The Earth is home to 20 quadrillion individual ants. If you are someplace in the tropics, the neotropics, you're never more than 6 feet away from an ant. In any event, it's those small creatures that really make the engines of the world, the nutrient cycling and the other ecological processes that make life possible for us. Most of that work is done by small creatures like ants. Interestingly, the most numerous vertebrate in the world is a fish that you will never see and you've probably never heard of. It's called the bristlemouth fish. And it lives in that environment that is where the darkness begins and the wide oceans. And they migrate from the darkness into the surface every night to feed. Their numbers are estimated in the hundreds of trillions. And until the roughly last 20 or 30 years, all the organisms that lived in that zone were unknown. We just didn't even know that there was a lot of life there. With the advent of radar, we often would send a signal down to what we thought was the bottom, and it would run into an entire layer of this fish. Not a particularly handsome critter, but clearly a very successful one. Oh, wrong way. As I mentioned, the numbers of species, again, the little things dominate, and their importance cannot be underestimated. If you look at the percentage of described species, you see the little sliver, the vertebrates. Well, that includes us and about 14,000 species of mammals and a roughly similar number of birds and other vertebrates. Fish, more like probably somewhere around 50,000 when all the work's done. But in any event, again, the what we like to call the higher animals are a small component of biodiversity overall. Again, the arthropods, the insects, are the champions. If you don't include the microbes, which you're only beginning to know how numerous and how many kinds of those creatures there are and how dependent we are on them. On the right-hand side, you could see the yellow lady slipper, which is a wildflower that can be found in this region. So the number 2 in terms of number of biodiversity are the plants, the flowering plants and the coniferous plants, of which there are about 250,000 that we know so far. So with that, I'm going to move on to this concept of ecosystem biodiversity. So basically, an ecosystem is the habitat that groups of organisms, groups of species are adapted to living in, and those ecosystems vary widely across the planet. Probably when you hear that term, what comes to mind is something like the tropical forest you see there on the left-hand side, or maybe the coral reefs, and rightfully so. And those two ecosystems is by far the greatest concentration of biodiversity. Probably 80% of the world's biodiversity are in those two types of habitats or ecosystems. Nonetheless, you don't have to go far to find enormous biodiversity, like the kind we have in our backyard here in an Appalachian cove forest. This photograph is from Southwest Virginia, but there are probably a dozen species in their prime blooming in this scene. Particularly, I could see the red trilliums are there in the foreground, but we have been blessed with enormous amount of diversity here in the Southern Appalachians. There's a lot of geological and, if you will, historic, in the big sense, reasons why we have such biodiversity, but we are blessed to have as much as we have, and we are tagged with the responsibility to make sure it continues. So the web of life is also a safety net. It's, complex ecosystems of which soil is a living ecosystem as well. And I hope this works. Yes. The soil contains maybe a quarter of all the biodiversity in the planet. That's an estimate because it's an ecosystem directly below our feet that we still know poorly. And hopefully we'll learn more about it. But that fearsome looking creature you see on the right-hand side, you probably walked over today if you live in Western North Carolina and you took a step outside. It's called a pseudoscorpion. They're one of the fierce predators in the soil, but they're only about, I don't know, 1/100 of an inch long. And they're quite common. So that's sort of an unknown area that we're still exploring, but the importance of soil for every living thing on the planet cannot be underestimated. So next time you take a step out in your yard, consider the fact that there are monsters below your feet. I mentioned early on about genetic biodiversity, and here's an interesting story that sort of illustrates that. And the reason why France and their great wines, the people who have to thank for those great wines in large degree are the good folks of Missouri. Here's the story. As you know, there are a great number of varieties of grapes across the world. And on the left-hand side, you see some of the varieties that are grown and still in the Middle East. So there are hundreds of varieties, though that number is decreasing. In any event, there was a blight that hit the French countryside in the mid-1800s. And at one point in the 1860s, 1/3 of all French vineyards were basically out of work because of the loss of the grapes there. Fortunately, there were varieties of grapes that had come to the United States and were being grown in Missouri. And the rootstock of those grapes were transported back to France.
Rachel, you wound up on mute.
Mute. Thank you. Don't know when that happened. Was I in the middle of grape talk when that happened?
Yes.
Okay. The short story is that they were able to take root cuttings from grapevines in Missouri, transport them back to France, which basically saved the French wine crop. So next time you treat yourself to a bottle of good French wine, you have the good folks in Missouri to thank, and you've got genetic biodiversity to thank as well. Another example of genetic biodiversity, which is probably a pretty well-known example, you may have heard of it, but again, it's the variation within species. Now, the cheetah is a species that's in trouble because of habitat loss and poaching, but the other issue that cheetahs are facing and other species, including some here in North America, face is that they have fairly limited genetic biodiversity. In this case, the genetic diversity in cheetahs had to do with an accident in history. They used to be widespread in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But then when their populations shrank, probably because of human interference, the African population became isolated with relatively little genetic diversity. So for that reason, they are a species that is particularly at risk. That's often the case when populations of organisms are whittled down to just a small number. There's not much genetic diversity left in that population. And that's why there's a threshold at which it becomes more and more difficult to save species that are under some kind of environmental pressure or loss of population. One of the things we can do is try to encourage our lawmakers and our policymakers to try and save species before they're endangered, before we're down to the last population. That makes a greater opportunity for that species to rebound. More about that a little later. So let me be clear, genetic variability in a species is not always to the benefit of that individual. Some genetic variation is not advantageous to that individual, but having genetic variation within a population is very helpful, because when you have a change in environment, that means you've got some individuals in your population who can adapt to that. Think for a moment about climate change and changes in temperature. If you've got organisms that are by chance adapted to, say, warmer, drier conditions, that will be the strain that will continue on in a climate altered planet in the future. So maintaining that genetic diversity is important. This example here is, I think, a festive one, the festive tiger beetle. These are all a single species. All these colors are one species. And I'm guessing, not knowing the particulars of their biology, but this is probably some signal to potential mates that we're this species, not this species. Not all of these are going to work, but in the long run, here's a species that's well adapted to a variety of conditions. So back to North Carolina. No longer grapes in the Middle East, but back to North Carolina and our diversity. The Southern Appalachians have an extraordinary diversity of flowering plants and other plants. You can see on the left-hand side is a photograph I took of Indian pipes up near Mount Mitchell. They're a species that has no chlorophyll, and basically they're parasites on the roots, though their relationship with the trees that they are parasites for is probably more complex. On the right-hand side, you have the common maidenhair fern, which this happens to be my front yard. And you can have this glorious kind of biodiversity growing just outside your door if you plant native species. There are some more common examples that just a walk in our mountains on a summer's day that you'll be able to see, or in the case of the running cedar on the right-hand side, you can see any day because they're evergreen. There's a club moss, Lycopodium digitatum, that grows pretty commonly here. But it also has a tight connection to the microbes and fungus that grow with it. So if you try to transplant it, it probably won't work. It's got a fairly intricate connection to the organisms there in the earth directly below it. This beautiful Gray's lily is a high elevation endemic, endemic meaning pretty much only found in the southern Appalachian Mountains. So I talked about ecological diversity or ecosystem diversity earlier, and some fairly exotic places, the tropics and coral reefs. Well, we don't need to go far to go to what here is a pretty exotic ecosystem, and that's the southern Appalachian spruce fir forests that you could find in areas like Mount Mitchell and the Smokies. They're dominated by two tree species, the red spruce and Fraser fir, which basically are only found over about 5,500 feet here. These are basically remnants of the last ice age that made their way all the way at the high elevations here in the mountains and were more widespread 10,000 years ago. But this is a bit of a, what I call a mountain island. So the challenge for these species, and particularly with a change like climate change, is that as the temperature warms, the cooler areas where these trees and the associated species can live becomes more and more limited until that island, just like rising water, eventually disappears. And when they do, the habitat for these species and the other species associated with it goes away. So in this case, these two species are found further north, but these would disappear from our region if climate change continues at its present pace. They might go away in our lifetimes, intergeneration for the most part. There are other pressures on these plants as well. Historically, they were badly injured by acid rain, but that's an example of a problem that we've solved. A lot of these issues with biodiversity are solvable. That ecosystem, which is just about 30 miles from my house at the furthest distance, contains some species not found really anyplace else. The Carolina flying squirrel there on the left-hand side is a subspecies of the northern flying squirrel, which is on the endangered species list. I've seen the northern flying squirrel. I haven't seen this particular subspecies, but you can find them on Mount Mitchell if you are very diligent and active there at dawn or dusk. The pygmy salamanders, tiny guys, about that big, one of many salamanders found in the southern Appalachians. The Great Smokies National Park alone has 31 species of salamanders known from within its borders. Oh, on the right-hand side, the far right-hand side, here's something. Another tiny thing that's still kind of scary. This is the world's smallest tarantula. The spruce fir moss spider, which is on the endangered species list, is only found in environments like the ones you find in these spruce fir forests. They're quite scarce, but it is, in fact, a member of the tarantula family, and it just happens to be its smallest member. It's probably like, at tops, 1/5 of an inch across from front leg to back leg. A tiny terror. It feeds on tiny insects in the moss. But even you don't have to drive up to the top of the mountains to see extraordinary biodiversity in the southern Appalachians. These are both photographs taken from my front yard. The stunning Actinus luna, the luna moth, which is common here in the summer months. It feeds on the tulip tree primarily as a caterpillar. And then our wonderful eastern box turtle, which was first identified and thus named in Carolina. So I just want to get across just how special a place the southern Appalachians are. If Martin the Martian landed on the planet and said, "Take me to your most diverse temperate ecosystem in the world," we might want to direct them to the southern Appalachians. And let me give you some examples. I mentioned salamanders and just how many species we have in our region, but that also holds true for a whole other suite of organisms. On the right-hand side, you have a recently discovered species of crayfish. This wonderful creature is called the jewel mudbug. I think mudbug is a little unfair to this particular organism with its wonderful colors. This is one of the burrowing crayfish, which instantly, I think is very interestingly, have often very bright colors, but they spend their life underground or in the dark. That's a bit of a mystery, even to an ecologist like me. The green salamander, which you can see on the left-hand side, is one of our species at risk here in the Appalachians, often having relatively narrow ecological niche. So this one, which I've seen, basically you're going to find in seeps or springs in the high mountains. Beautiful when you have that opportunity. They are as lovely as they seem to be in this picture, only a little more animated. Oh. So I'm going to start to edge into this, not only biodiversity, but also into this idea that the services that biodiversity provides us here in this part of the world. These are another set of endemic species to the southeast. On the left-hand side, you see a whole handful, 2 handfuls actually, of freshwater mussels. These are clams that live in fresh water, and they are maybe champions at filtering water and cleaning water. A demonstration of that you can see on the right-hand side. Just putting several of these mussels and letting them filter water for 24 hours can take a 20-gallon tank like that and clean the debris out of it like nobody's business. Historically, there were about 30 species that we know of, probably more, in the French Broad River. And many of those were eliminated during the most polluted era for the French Broad, but they're beginning to come back. We have about 5 species which can be found there now, but they used to be so common that they were doing an excellent job of cleaning all the water that passed over them in the French Broad. I have to talk a little bit about one of my favorite organisms, and these are these freshwater mussels, because the ecological services they provide are so enormous. They provide habitat, they stabilize the bottom of rivers, and I know in this part of the world we all have a great affection for the French Broad and its tributaries. If we can reestablish these species in the French Broad, it would be a great step forward in helping to improve the water quality. So here's the trick. If you're a freshwater mussel and say you're this big, big as my head essentially, how do you get upstream? How does a mussel get upstream to do its ecological business? Well, it has developed this unique system of transporting itself. The female will come up from the surface, and you can see on the right-hand side, and this its mantle has evolved so that it has a mimic of a minnow that fish will try to attack and take a bite out of. When they do, the female releases basically baby clams. They're called glaucidia. And those glaucidia hook onto the fish, stay on the fish until they get someplace that's an appropriate environment. With the right chemical signals, they drop off, and that's how something this big can make its way upstream. And there are all kinds of lures like this. There's some that mimic crayfish. There's some that mimic insects, all kinds of marvelous innovations that the species has produced to solve that evolutionary problem. And it has no eyes. It created this perfect mimic of fish with no vision. They also have no brains. They have only a very diffuse nervous system. It's just one of the wonders of the natural world that this kind of behavior could have evolved. So talking about mussels, though, both mussels and fish, which are quite diverse in our part of the world, if you look at the map on the left-hand side and you look at that red and yellow colors, that's an indicator of where species are in trouble or at risk from this map that's produced by NatureServe back in 2005 and has since been updated. I actually worked with these folks in that same year. I remember when this came out. The reason that those many species that we have here are in trouble has to do with impacts we've had on water quality. So some of the solutions to protecting biodiversity in our part of the world, which is dominated by diversity in aquatic systems, in wetlands, rivers, and streams, is to take better care of our waters. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see all the species, all the stream links that have some sort of impact, either the 305D listing, which the French Broad just got, which is primarily for E. coli issues, but all the streams that are impacted are a similar way, or that have dams on them, which also influence the water quality in those streams. So let's take a minute as we get to the end of our time to talk about solutions. And essentially they come down to this: smart land use, smart water use. So on the right-hand side, you see an example of something that we could do in our communities, and that is establish standards for riparian buffers. If we're able to let natural growth come up along our streams and rivers, that provides protection from erosion, from pesticides getting into the streams, and also provides some degree of protection in flooding. Also, keeping those systems open to the floodplain whenever possible. That's really the key to flood protection. Considering the floodplain, it's really part of the river, and that has to be reflected in our regulations and the choices we make about building and construction in the floodplain. Also, smart choices about agriculture, where it occurs, how it's done, proper use of pesticides. Very importantly, proper use of herbicides and fertilizers is key to keeping that good water quality. Good, sound land use, good, sound protection of our water. And one of the ways to do that is we can actually protect more land if we take the patches on the landscape of protected habitat, like parks, and we connect them. If you look at the right-hand side, that's a scene from California where there's a small stream, of which there are few in the Sacramento Valley, but there's a stream there that they are protecting through that riparian buffer idea. On the left-hand side, this is a photograph I took flying into Charlotte. And if you've peeked out an airplane window, you can see this in almost every major city of the United States, this rapid urban sprawl and growth that isolates sections of woods and habitats that makes them of relatively low value for wildlife, for protecting streams and from runoff and other things. So folks, when it gets right down to it, some kind of smart planning, some kind of zoning is what's the most beneficial thing we can see at the local level to protect biodiversity. This is a solution that's in the works. We had a presentation a couple months ago about building wildlife corridors on our highways. If you drive in this part of the world, I will bet you don't drive a single morning where you don't see some small mammal that has been killed on a roadway. Multiply that by thousands of miles of roadway, and you realize what an enormous impact our roads have on wildlife of all kinds, from anything from insects right up to black bears. This is a photograph on the right-hand side off of US 40 of a bear and this family looking to cross. What's being planned and what's being worked on now is these wildlife corridors, a way for wildlife to get over or under. And this photograph is it's probably from Interstate 70, because I know they built several there, but it's from Colorado, and they really work. Colorado has the largest migratory deer herd in the world, the Piceance Basin herd, and they built these kind of passageways for those animals. So the other thing we can do is encourage restoration. Many of our streams have been impacted by urban growth, agriculture that was not well thought out, and this stream, which was impacted by agricultural methods, I'll kindly call it, has been restored to the point that hellbenders are now living back in the stream, which is a real great thing. Hellbender is the largest salamander in North America, and is increasingly rare. So the big picture is, look at every landscape as a shared landscape, a landscape that obviously will have human elements, like the scene you can see here, but also has room for nature. I hope by virtue of this discussion that you will notice that this photograph includes a stream that doesn't have a riparian buffer. I would add that, and I would add some more diversity in the crops that are being grown. But this idea that humans can live in concert with the other organisms on the planet is one that I think is fundamental to an approach that will protect biodiversity. So here's one way to think about it. Biodiversity is not a place you go. It's not a destination. It's something we live in and is around us. It provides us all those things you see on the left-hand side. And I would love to talk more about some of the particulars here, but some of our most potent and important medicines, and certainly everything that makes our life possible, comes from the natural world. And in the long run is a byproduct of biodiversity. So I'm ready for some questions, but if you want to learn more about biodiversity and natural history, I do teach courses both at the Osher Long-Term Learning Institute and at the Arboretum. You can contact me at this email, or you can go to one of my favorite little institutions, which is the Greater Asheville Science for All Book Club. And once every 2 months, we look into an interesting science topic. We'd love to have you join us. And thank you for your time and attention tonight. Now time for some questions. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Rachel. That was excellent. So would you like to speak a little bit more how someone could join the book club if they were interested, please?
If they go online to Facebook, and you can find the Greater Asheville Science for All Book Club, or they can contact me at drnature@gmail.com. That's an easy one to remember.
Question, as the climate is changing, and you actually did a program a year or so ago on cockroaches and ticks and so on, multiplying with the increase in temperature. Do you have comments on that, of how people can somehow live in peace with the changes?
There's two approaches to climate change. One is adaptation, and the other is mitigation. And we have to be working on both of those simultaneously. Climate change is here, and we've seen the results of that, large and small. We also see it in our weather, and we see it also in the changes in the distribution of biodiversity. If you're talking about particulars of how to adapt to, say, new pests making their way into Western North Carolina, one organism or set of organisms that are here much more commonly than they were before are ticks. Ticks carrying diseases like Lyme's disease, which I suffered through for 2 years, but they're Rocky Mountain spotted fever, babiosis. There's a whole host of diseases that are a result of tick infestations. So what can we do? One thing I could think of is that we'd want to discourage, in the case of Lyme's disease, we want to discourage large congregations of deer. Deer populations historically are about, roughly 10 per square mile in the forest habitat, but in our suburban habitats, they're far more common. They could be 10 times that. When that happens, they do carry the deer ticks, which are responsible for Lyme's disease. And when you have large concentrations of those deer populations, we're more likely to see Lyme's disease showing up in our neighborhoods. So do things like don't feed deer. Try to keep your landscape as natural as possible, so it's not that much different from the woods that surround you, and you won't have them congregating in our neighborhoods and around our homes. Other questions or comments?
Can you comment on what you recommend? Like the French Broad is impaired now. Farmers who have cattle, what would you recommend in terms? The E. coli, I assume, is both cattle and human. Am I correct?
So the reason that there's probably E. coli, which is the reason that the French Broad got listed on the 305D program, which is the EPA program, is from two sources. One is we are still quite a number of individual septic systems, which are probably failing relatively close to the stream. So that those contaminants are making their way into the French Broad through groundwater. The second is runoff from farms and from urban areas. And those in combination have resulted in that higher concentration, particularly during warm weather. So honestly, the French Broad is looking much better than it's looked ever, and many generations. It's doing quite well. It's generally quite clean. But we do have these circumstances where we do have more E. coli in the system, largely temperature dependent, and to some degree in low flow conditions is when that happens, when the water becomes more stagnant. So the things I've just described, riparian buffers to protect from agricultural runoff, and the good planning in our cities to reduce runoff from roads roofs, and yards are the best things we can do to improve the water quality for the French Broad and protect the tributaries.
Do you think there needs to be actual county laws or state laws, or what would you recommend?
Riparian buffers, 50 to 100 feet, depending on the circumstances. Say maybe a requirement for agricultural circumstances, or when building, you don't build homes right on the river or right on the stream. Give them a little room to breathe. Also ups the chance that you won't get flooded.
Question, how can we save the ash tree and also the hemlock?
Oh, there's a systemic treatment for hemlock, and pretty much you have to do that tree by tree. It's a pesticide. It's systemic, which means it gets up into the roots of the hemlock. Ash borer is a much tougher question and a really disturbing one. The ash species make up about 10% of our eastern forests. The ash borer was introduced in wood products in the upper Midwest maybe 15 years ago, and it's keeps spreading. The best thing you can do is do not move firewood around. Since these trees are dying, they're ending up in firewood supplies. When you move that around, the ash borer moves around with it. So that is one recommendation. The other is, sadly, if you have trees that are infected and they're beyond, there's also a systemic way to treat them with pesticides. But if they're dead or dying, go ahead and take them down. Maybe replace it with another one and keep an eye on it. It's going to be a long and protracted battle. There's no magic bullet that I can see in the near horizon.
Do these pesticides affect our bee population?
No. They're actually placed in the ground. They make their way from the roots to the organism. There's not many pollen. Ash trees and hemlocks are wind pollinated, so it's not going to affect pollinators.
Is there currently a formal program or effort reintroducing mussels to the French Broad River?
There's an effort ongoing with the Fish and Wildlife Service and with the state Department of Natural Resources. So the essential thought is to take common species and reestablish them. There's one beautiful little mussel called the wavy rayed lamb mussel, which is fairly common and fairly tolerant. So if you get that one established in the French Broad, it will begin to clean the system up. It'll stabilize areas that are now tended to be, shifting silt and other kinds of debris which affect water quality. Stabilize those areas, and then the rarer species, including our Appalachian elk toe, which is an endangered species, will be more common in our streams. The good news is we've recently found that very rare species in the French Broad, and we found it in several of the tributaries. And I'm hoping to be involved in some protection for some of those tribs that still contain those rare mussel species. One other quick thought, if you want to do a little mussel hunting, go up to the Clinch River in Southwest Virginia or in Tennessee, or go to the Duck River in Tennessee, and you'll see them by the tens of thousands, and you'll see a couple dozen species. It's a pretty impressive sight. That's the way the French Broad could be if we could get these organisms reintroduced to the system.
Well, Rachel, that was outstanding, amazing. And thank you for your presentation. And if folks want to reach out to Rachel, you have her email. She is Dr. Nature, and she deserves the name Dr. Nature. So
it's a great honor to be here this evening, and I do look forward to, if you have questions, feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to talk to you about them.
absolutely. And please, you all come back 1 month from now, December 1st, 7 o'clock, to hear about climate change and birding with Simon Thompson. The title is indeed The Changing Migration Patterns here in our area. And it's called Changing Feathers, Changing Seasons. So we'll see you back in a month. So thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome. Go vote, everybody.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.